All right, good afternoon everybody, and welcome to the third part of our lecture series on the Second World War. From the perspective of Canadian high schools, and I can only speak for those in British Columbia at the moment, we don't really emphasize a lot of the narrative of World War II from the perspective of the Pacific. And part of that is, of course, there wasn't a lot of Canadian activity in the Pacific. Yes, there were Canadians in Hong Kong when Japan invaded on Christmas Day 1941, but for the most part, Canadian efforts were focused, for the most part, of course, in Europe. So that, I believe, is why there is a tendency not to focus on the Pacific. However, when you're looking at the Second World War as a whole picture, as the big picture, it seems to me incredibly negligent not to spend a considerable amount of time focusing on the incredible efforts of the American Army, Navy, and Air Force, of course, in the Pacific, that they really had their work cut out for them on so many levels. They were fighting a very different kind of war as well compared to those in Europe. This was a body of water that expanded thousands of kilometers, that required island hopping from island to island and building airstrips. And the Americans were fighting on a completely different terrain that dealt with extreme heat, that dealt with a tenacious enemy. We're going to talk quite a bit about the tenacity of the Japanese Imperial Army. It's interesting to me, though, when you look at the experience of these two dictatorships, when you look at Imperial Japan and you also look at Nazi Germany, very rarely do we use the moniker fascist when we talk about Imperial Japan. And I'm a little bit perplexed why we don't use that term. I mean, they had all the hallmarks of fascism. They had a sense of racial superiority, they had a tremendous sense of militarism, nationalism, imperialism, conquest, you name it, that despite being incredibly culturally different, they had all the hallmarks of a fascist dictatorship. So, that's something we can leave to the historians to debate, but it does pose some interesting questions. One of the other remarkable pieces about this story is the idea that how is it that two cultures that were disconnected, and I'm using Germany and Japan as this example, how they both shared so many common traits, yet they developed completely independently of each other. It's a remarkable story, and it isn't surprising that in 1937 they would become friends. And of course the consequence of that would be remarkable, because the very end of the war, of course, would be the dropping of the bomb on Nagasaki, the first of which was in Hiroshima on August 6th and the second on August 9th. So a lot of very, very interesting things to look at when we look at Japan and the war in the Pacific. So start at the beginning here. Since the early 20th century, Japan began to see itself as the preeminent Asian power, and no major power could do without raw materials, especially rubber and oil. You might recall that when I talked about Operation Barbarossa in part 2 of this series, the fundamental draw that the Nazis had in the Caucasus was oil. You cannot fight a war without oil. You need rubber and oil. And most wars of conquest, for that matter, you could even argue imperialism was all about getting access to raw materials. So Japan would invade Manchuria in 1931 with the goal of getting access to much needed raw materials as well as access to slave labor. Sound familiar? We have to consider that the Japanese held the same kind of attitude toward the Chinese as the Nazis did the Soviets. They were subhuman, they were weaker, therefore they were at our dispense to exploit. And Manchuria was very resource rich. In many ways, I would argue that the invasion of Manchuria is really the beginning of the Second World War. When you look at the Second World War from, as I said, a global perspective, we know the war in Europe starts with the invasion of Poland in 39, but certainly in the Pacific theater of the war, it starts with the invasion of Manchuria. By 1937, Japan invaded the rest of China, and while it gave Japan a huge market, it angered the Americans, who were now unable to sell products in the area. A lot of times when we begin to talk about the American part and their role in this war, it starts with the invasion of Pearl Harbor. And I'm almost surprised how little discussion there is about why. I mean, why did the Japanese invade? Why? What was happening that led up to this? And this is kind of where it begins. Roosevelt was furious because it suddenly, once they invaded mainland China, all those markets and economic relationship that the Americans had with mainland China were suddenly cut off. By early 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you'll see FDR, that's what FDR stands for, demanded a withdrawal of Japanese troops from China and Indochina, and blocked the sale of oil to Japan. Okay, so this is interesting. Indochina, I should mention, it was a French colony at the time, and it encompassed Laos, current day Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So the boycott or the blocking of oil sales to Japan was a protest against the Japanese invasion of China. And of course the Japanese were furious because they need oil to continue their efforts of conquest in the Pacific. It's interesting to me also that the Japanese never figured that maybe by cutting off American markets in this way would anger the Americans, and they were going to do something. And certainly the embargo of oil sales to Japan was the beginning. Negotiations stalled and a peaceful solution faded away. So certainly the Japanese were not willing to pull out of their conquest of China, and certainly the Americans were going to continue not selling Japan oil. So November, General Tojo became Prime Minister in Japan, and he assured his king, or emperor as we know him as, Hirohito, that Japan could win a war. You know, Hirohito's role in all this is almost kind of, I don't know if ambiguous is the right word, but, you know, very, very much, he was a very remote character. He was treated like a god. You know, the Japanese people saw him as an absolute monarch figure, and even though he didn't rule, he was really seen as sort of the central focus of the Japanese people, who treated him like a god. So, but he very much became under the spell and influence of military commanders who began to assert quite a bit more influence during as this war rolls out. Well, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese under Admiral Yamamoto attacked Pearl Harbor with over 200 aircraft in the early morning. With no official declaration of war, the U.S. was completely caught off guard, which led to 2,350 American deaths. 5 battleships were sunk and 3 were put out of action. Additionally, 200 aircraft were destroyed, largely on the ground. The Japanese offensive in Pearl Harbor was completely surprising. And I mean, of course there was tension between the Americans and the Japanese. Of course there was a cauldron of anger and resentment bubbling, but I don't think the Americans ever would have thought that the Japanese would have the audacity to do this. What is even more interesting is the idea that the Japanese thought that by destroying 5 battleships and attacking Pearl Harbor, that the Americans would just roll over and die. And what they had in fact done is they'd woken a sleeping elephant, to use a metaphor that has often been used in this context. To think that they're just going to put their tail between their legs and run out of Hawaii was a bit naive on the part of the Japanese. And in many ways I would draw the comparison that the Japanese invasion of Pearl Harbor was very similar to the Soviet invasion of, or rather the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Because once those nations invaded those two nations, at that point, really, the war was unwinnable. So, Only 29 Japanese planes were shot down, and the U.S. was rendered immobile for the next 6 months. So it definitely had an impact. Luckily though, 3 U.S. aircraft carriers were out at sea doing drills, and this would have serious consequences for Japan later on at the Battle of Midway, which would occur roughly 6 months after the Pearl Harbor episode. By May, Japan controlled Malaya, Singapore, Burma, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and 2 U.S. bases at Guam and Wake Island. You know, you have to consider that by the time the Japanese invade Pearl Harbor, they had been fighting a war for 10 years, if you count Manchuria as the start of this thing. And from Manchuria all the way down through the Philippines, through New Guinea, through Burma, Malaya, and all these other places, they basically ran roughshod. They did not at any time face an enemy that was putting up much of a challenge. Not only because the Japanese imperial armies were extremely well trained and devoted, but the armies that they faced were really unprepared for this kind of a war. So when the Americans get in this war, that's where things begin to shift. So, Midway, June 1942, this sea battle occurred off the Midway Islands between June 3rd and June 6th. Unfortunately, I don't have a map, but Midway, of course, is quite a bit north of Pearl Harbor, and it's smack in the middle of the Pacific. There's nothing around these islands at all. But what's important, the reason these small, insignificant islands become important, because it becomes a place where you can reconnect all your air forces, because airplanes can only fly so far. What were the Japanese doing as they island hopped their way down the South Pacific? They built airfields on these islands. So the Americans are looking to do the same thing. The Japanese attack included 5 aircraft carriers with nearly 400 planes and some 5,000 troops. Though outnumbered, the U.S. sank 4 Japanese carriers and 296 planes to the U.S. loss of 1 carrier and 132 aircraft. Now, aircraft carriers. These are no small affair. You sink an aircraft carrier, you have eliminated a significant threat. I believe, now I might have a point come up later, but I believe you could house 80 airplanes on these aircraft carriers. And you know what's remarkable is thinking about how these things took off and how they landed, which is often overlooked in this story, which I think is fascinating. So the planes would have to start right at the back side of the plane. You can see on the aircraft carriers, the planes are all lined up on the sides, right? And the plane would have to go as far back on one side and gain enough speed so by the time it got to the end, it would lift off and go, right? Takeoff, pretty straightforward. Landing was a different situation. What they would do is they would come in and land on this side, and there would be usually this long cable across, I think it was roughly the middle of the aircraft carrier, and then the plane would have a cable and a hook at the end of it. So when they landed, they dragged this cable with a hook that would catch the cable along the way, and like a springboard would kind of stop it from heading all the way over to the end of the aircraft carrier where it could potentially fall in the water. So, for example, on occasion when these airplanes, when the hooks missed the cable running along, which did happen, the aircraft carriers would just simply go right, boom, into the end of the ocean from the end of the aircraft carrier. Midway put a stop to Japan's successful rampage in the Pacific, and it would become the decisive turning point for the U.S. So Midway for the U.S. was like Stalingrad for the Soviets. So it becomes the tipping point where things begin to shift the other way. Within 9 months, the U.S. had 19 aircraft carriers in the Pacific against Japan's 10. At the end of the day, Japan did not have the labor supply, the resources, the manpower that the Americans did. And once you woke that sleeping elephant in the United States, you awoke, you know, we had 11 million people who were mobilized. I can't remember the exact figure, I'd have to look, but 11 million troops, I believe, millions of people working in factories on the home front. So this was an economy that was really on fire, and boy, could they could outproduce anybody at this time. So carriers and aircraft would be a decisive factor in this naval war, and the U.S. would have the upper hand after Midway. So after Midway, it was basically a matter of slowly and methodically chipping away at Japanese control of the South Pacific. However, before this, the Japanese were much better equipped to do battle in the tropical terrain of the South Pacific. Now at this point we're talking predominantly before the Americans get involved in the war. The British did not have the air and sea power to challenge Japan before the U.S. got involved. Of course, there were Japanese imperial interests in Malaya and in other parts of the South Pacific. Burma, of course. British preoccupation with war in Europe left them vulnerable in Malaya, Burma, and Singapore. The Japanese had been fighting since 1931 and had a fanatical devotion to die for their emperor. Death was honorable, and they did not believe in being taken prisoner. In many ways, I think this is what made fighting the Japanese in a hand-to-hand type of combat situation, as we see the Americans have to do for the first time at Guadalcanal. It's a very different kind of war when you're dropping bombs on islands, or if you're shooting artillery from battleships. But when you are fighting with a rifle and a bayonet, hand-to-hand with an enemy like the Japanese, who were more than willing and happy to die for their cause, it's a pretty terrifying set of circumstances to find yourself in. Certainly the Nazi troops were brutal too, but I think in many ways the Japanese were even more fearsome for that very reason. The Bushido Code of loyalty and honor led the Japanese to fight to the death, often brutally. The Bushido Code. Wow, it's sort of an extension of this samurai mentality. Absolute devotion. I mean, later when we get to the kamikazes, I mean, these young boys knew they were going to be flying their planes, and I'm sure, and I know many of them were absolutely terrified, but at the end of the day, they were doing it for their emperor. And very different cultural framework in Japan, as we saw, certainly in the United States at the time. So the Pacific would be divided into two areas of command: the Pacific Ocean area under Admiral Chester Nimitz, and the Southwest Pacific under General Douglas MacArthur. Of course, General Douglas MacArthur would cast quite a long, fascinating shadow in the history of the military. Certainly he was involved in the First World War, and of course he becomes a very significant player in the Korean War, which we'll come back to and look at another time. First step after Midway was to clear the Japanese out of New Guinea and Guadalcanal on the Solomon Islands, which they did by early 1943. I want to pause for a moment on Guadalcanal, because Guadalcanal was the first experience that the Americans had in hand-to-hand combat with the Japanese. And when they arrived on this island, it was very quiet, and the Japanese were there on the island. It was the Americans that had to come to Guadalcanal, where the Japanese already were. It was thick tropical jungle. And in the first engagement, the Japanese were so used to completely terrifying their enemy just by the sheer force of their presence that they come running at the Americans with their rifles and machine guns and bayonets, almost like a sort of World War I bayonet trench charge in a way. And the Americans are dumbstruck, who have their mounted machine guns ready to go, and they just mow down the Japanese. It's a bloodbath, those first battles, and the Americans were absolutely dumbstruck that the Japanese would be willing to just run at the Americans in this manner. Guadalcanal was the first hand-to-hand combat, as we said, between the Japanese and the Americans from August to November 42. This region was the gateway to Australia, and the Japanese threat was a real one. Australia was in a state of siege, because the Japanese were extremely close, and of course there was a lot of fear, certainly in the northern parts, particularly Darwin, up in north of Australia. Realistically, the Japanese were never in a position to effectively take control of Australia. Once again, much like the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, how do you control and contain that size of a country? How do you put all those people under your control, and so on and so forth? It was not really realistic, but if you were in Australia at the time, it was a pretty terrifying set of circumstances to be in. After this success, the U.S. leapfrogged from one island to the next, bypassing the heavily fortified ones, and so cutting them off to wither on the vine, as MacArthur described it. This is quite brilliant strategy. If you think of all these dotted islands that work their way up to Japan, and all these islands are connected by airfields so that the Japanese can hop their way down to controlling the South Pacific. You don't necessarily have to take all of those islands one by one. You can scoot up and take a couple in the middle, because as long as you disrupt that chain, those lines of communication and flight patterns, you've disrupted their ability to move on one island to the next. So the idea of leaving them to wither on the vine was an interesting concept. Here's a picture of the South Pacific. Here you can see Australia, New Guinea, there's Indochina here, Indonesian islands. The Battle of Coral Sea down here. And you can see that's pretty close to Australia. The Battle of Coral Sea occurred from May 4th to 8th, a 4-day battle in 1942, and was the first major sea battle involving aircraft carriers. Japan suffers a defeat of the war during the Battle of the Coral Sea off New Guinea, the first time in history that two opposing carrier forces fought only using aircraft without the opposing ships ever sighting each other. Interesting idea, that there was no contact between the battleships. It was all aerial. And of course there's no land. So, one of the remarkable things is that if you were out with your comrades out flying to face the enemy and your battleship was sunk, when you came back to land, there was no ship there. And there's lots of video of either American or Japanese planes just sort of gently landing on the water, and because they've run out of fuel. So, interesting. 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea enabled Nimitz to take control of the Marianas Islands, from which B-29 bombers could now launch constant raids on Japan itself. This was enormous. Once you get to the point, once the Americans got to the point where they could send B-29 bombers over Japan and drop a mother load of bombs, once you can bomb the homeland, that's when you begin to really move towards an eventual invasion of the island. October 1944, the Battle of Lake Gulf would prove to be the largest sea battle in history, costing Japan 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Battle of Lake Gulf was huge. The U.S. lost only 3 carriers and 200 planes to Japan's 500. The thing is, if you continue to have these kinds of battles, and you continue to lose less than the enemy, eventually you will win by there being nothing left of the enemy. And that was really the goal of the U.S., was just to completely wear down the Japanese. Lake Gulf also saw the introduction of kamikaze fighters. Kamikaze fighters, this is an act of desperation. And there's video of these poor young boys having their last sip of sake before they get onto their planes, knowing darn well, what they were going to face. And just the thought of your goal is to fly into an aircraft carrier. Tragic. These boys, these Japanese boys were 20, 21, 22 years old, and here their life was coming to an end. It's part of the Bushido Code, and they're paying their honor and homage, to their emperor. So, after Lake Gulf, Japan was cut off from its supply of oil in the Dutch East Indies, and most of the Japanese fleet was sunk. What's remarkable is that the closer the Americans got to the Japanese islands, the more tenacious and dogged the Japanese fought to defend their homeland. So it didn't get easier And I think in many ways the battles of Okinawa and the battles of Iwo Jima taught the Americans that when and if we get to a point where we're ready to invade the home island itself, the islands of Japan, it is going to be ugly. And we'll come back to this very topic when we talk about the decision to drop the bombs. The invasion of Iwo Jima began on February 19, 1944 and continued to March. The battle was the first U.S. attack on the Japanese home islands, and the Imperial soldiers defended their position tenaciously. This is an interesting statistic. Of the 21,000 Japanese soldiers present at the beginning of the battle, over 19,000 of them were killed, and only 1,000 and change were taken prisoner, and over 6,800 Americans died. What does that tell you when 19,000 of 21,000 troops are killed? They were going to fight to the death, right to the end. So, at Okinawa, the 82-day-long battle lasted from April 1st until June 22nd, 1945. And you can see here, halfway through the Battle of Okinawa, the war in Europe comes to an end. The battle was one of the bloodiest in the Pacific, with an estimated total of over 82,000 direct casualties on both sides. 14,000 Allied deaths, over 12,500 Americans were killed or missing, and 77,000 Japanese soldiers, excluding those who died from their injuries later. These are pretty lopsided casualties, but it is a testament to the absolute dogged determination and willingness of the Japanese soldiers to die in battle. After Okinawa, the stage was set for an invasion of Japan. Well, before we get into the final stage of this war, I wanted to look at the arguments that were being made against dropping the bomb. This is both during and after, so it's they're kind of mixed together. But it kind of gives you some thoughts about, trying to find a rationality. I mean, the rationality is pretty clear why you should drop it, but these are some of the arguments that people made for or against, and they're interesting to ponder even today. The arguments for, these would be the reasons and the reasons people and decision makers would make for dropping the bomb. And these were, people who were talking about it before it happened and rationalizing it after it happened. Number one reason, the war party of Japan was still in control and showed no interest in peace terms. There's no question that Japan was not going to surrender. That is a very valid point. In fact, even after the dropping of the first bomb, they didn't surrender. Number two, an invasion of Japan would lead to over 1 million 1 million casualties. Certainly after Okinawa and Iwo Jima, the Americans knew that if they were going to invade the home islands, you had a whole fanatical population there that was going to defend to the teeth too. So civilians were going to do everything they could to fight off the Americans as well. Number three, ending the war ASAP would prevent the Soviets from getting a foothold on Japan. So, birth of the Cold War. Although that's another debate. The Cold War really begins in the Russian Civil War of 1918 to 21, but we'll come back to that another time. There was already discussions and an understanding that, and this is from an American perspective, what's our relationship going to be with the Soviet Union when this war is over? Because they weren't necessarily friends before World War II, and they certainly weren't friends after. So the thinking was, let's drop this bomb, end this war now, and then the Soviets, we don't need to, we won't require the Soviets to help in a landed invasion of Japan. Because if they did, the concern was that you'd end up with a Germany situation where already in Europe it was becoming a tug and pull between Russian occupying forces and British and French and American forces there too. So, regular Doolittle style bombing would lead to greater casualties than the atomic bomb. So another argument for dropping the bomb was, at the end of the day, as horrible as it would be, there'd be far less Japanese and American casualties than had the war continued in a hand-to-hand style kind of combat. As it was, Japan surrendered 1 week after the Nagasaki bombs, so once again that becomes an argument for, hey, we did the right thing, they finally called it quits, the war is over. And remember, in the dropping of the bomb, there were no American casualties. So from the American perspective, a lot of it made sense. The U.S. had spent millions on the development of the bomb, and it was successfully tested and ready to use. So the most important argument is, we got the weapon. The Japanese had proven that they were not going to give up. They were brutal, and we could end it like that. So I get it. I mean, I appreciate and understand the arguments for. But the arguments against, I think, are equally as valuable and interesting as well in this argument. The bomb could have been dropped on military targets or an open area to show the Japanese the power of the bomb. So why not demonstrate the power of the bomb? Tell the Japanese, meet at this field, or further back with your binoculars and have a look at what we've got here. Reality was, I think they only had 2 of them, didn't they? I'd have to look, but I believe Fat Man and Little Boy was it. So if you drop one and it's a dud, then you've only got one left, and so there's that argument too. But next, the military in Japan was prepared to discuss peace so long as the position of the emperor was preserved. At one point, the Allies refused this. So the Japanese had sent out feelers with the understanding that we want to make sure that our emperor stays, because he is such an important figure in Japanese culture, that don't take that away from us, and we will talk about some type of peace plan. Japan had already lost the war on the ground, and it was only a matter of time when Japan would give up. Well, that's wishful thinking. I like the idea of that position, but at the same time, they certainly hadn't proven their willingness to quit anytime soon. So the bomb caused appalling and gruesome casualties of 80,000 in Hiroshima and 130,000 eventual deaths from radiation sickness. Nagasaki saw over 40,000 deaths. This is the grim, tragic horror show of the dropping of the bomb in all its glory right there. So it's, it's a very, very difficult situation. Once again, as horrible as it was, an argument could be made that far fewer Japanese died than those who would have died had the Americans had a landed D-Day style invasion. The bomb was dropped as a warning to the USSR. So many believe that that was a big part of it. This was not just about ending the war with Japan. It was about telling the Soviets, hey, look what we've got. So there was that benefit too, I guess, in this emergent, renewed Cold War. Resulted in a destructive arms race and was one of the main causes of the Cold War. Yes, there's no question that the evidence suggested by the power of these bombs would result in the Soviet desire to get a bomb, which they themselves would get in 1949, and it does lead to a Cold War. So there you have the reasons for, the reasons against, and certainly as a teacher, I'm not terribly interested in making or suggesting my opinion, and my job is to sort of help students how to think, not what to think, and this is always a wonderful debate in the class because you can make really strong arguments for both points of view. Well, the Japanese finally do call it quits. The U.S. subs had sunk 75% of the Japanese merchant ships. And by 1945, industrial production had collapsed and Japan was regularly bombed. At Coral Sea, Midway, and Lake Gulf, U.S. had gained command of the air and sea and the air, so there was no question that from a military perspective, the Americans had the upper hand. The Japanese had simply overstretched themselves and had no major allies. Certainly the Germans were simply too far away for them to be of any use to them during the war. American production dramatically outstripped Japan from 1941 to 1945. This is important. The Japanese could simply not match the productive power and labor of the Americans. On August 14th, Japan surrendered unconditionally, and the signing occurred on the USS Missouri. on September 2nd in Tokyo Harbor. It happened on the USS Manchuria because that was Harry Truman's. I believe he's the one who requested it. He wanted it to be signed on the ship named after his home state. And I say Manchuria because my grandmother, my American grandmother, of course, my father's mother was from Manchuria. And as a young boy, whenever I would say Missouri, she would get after me and say, "Eric, it's not Missouri, it's Manchuria." I believe in Manchuria now they say Missouri, even the older generations, but certainly a generation or two ago, Manchuria was the standard. But anyway. Well, the evidence is pretty clear. This was the good war. That is, the defining lines between good and bad were very, very clear. So clearly it was the right war to fight. Certainly the revelations of Japanese atrocities in China, particularly in Nanking, made World War II an absolute justifiable necessity. I did not talk about Nanking in the previous part of this when we talked about the invasion of Japan because it is a gruesome affair. It is an absolute horror show of beheadings and grotesque murder on a massive scale. If you're interested in those kinds of details, you could certainly look up what's called the Rape of Nanking. That is not just a metaphor, there's a literal aspect to that as well. Nanking really taught us that there was something really malevolent about elements of the Japanese Imperial Army. So certainly Nazi atrocities in the USSR, oh my gosh, I mean 27 million Russian people died in this war. 27 million is 50% of World War II casualties. So 1 out of every 2 people that died in this war in the Pacific and the European theater were Russian, right? And that's because the Nazi armies laid waste, murderous waste, to the Russian people. It was a war of racism. It was a war of genocide. So, and certainly the Baltics was no different, and of course the Holocaust, which I will talk about in another lecture, which is why it was not included in this. It requires its own lecture. Was evident that this regime, never in the history of humankind had we ever seen anything like the Nazi regime. So it had to come to an end. World War II is largely a war fought by the Japanese and the Germans on principles of racial superiority and utter disregard and contempt of those they deemed inferior, which led to outrageous casualties at the end of the day. That's why there were so many civilian casualties, because the Japanese and the Nazis murdered relentlessly in the occupied territories, particularly for the Nazis in the East. The civilian murder was less so the farther west you went, but the further east you went in Europe, the more pervasive it became. World War II, fatality statistics vary, and so it's a difficult thing, but I'm giving you sort of the most commonly understood casualties. 50 million, ranging from 50 to more than 80 million. The higher figure of over 80 million includes deaths from war-related disease and famine. Civilians killed totaled 50 to 55 million, including 19 to 28 million from war-related disease and famine. Total combat deaths from 21 to 25 million, including deaths in captivity of about 5 million prisoners of war. So this was a war that had to be fought and had to be won. So I want to thank you very much for coming to or watching my lecture on YouTube. This is the third and final lecture in this series. And next one we're going to deal with the early part of the Cold War in Europe, particularly the 1945 to 1949 part. So thank you very much.